From lovely Maple Grove, Minnesota, and 6footmama.com, this is Still Growing with Jennifer Ebling. Still Growing is a gardening podcast dedicated to helping you and your garden grow. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Still Growing. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. I have another great show for you today, and it's all about weeds with Nancy the Weed Lady. But first, I'll just cover a couple of the usual housekeeping items before I get started. Don't forget, you can check out the show notes over at 6footmama.com. That's the number 6FTMAMA.com. And you can find the Still Growing podcast in the top menu and then just scroll down to episodes. Or you can head on over to iTunes. Please give me a review there if you do that. And you can also get the show at iTunes. If you happen to be listening on Stitcher Radio, hit that little thumbs up button down in the corner. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right. So a little bit about what's happening here this week. You can find it in my post on my blog called Back to School, Writing and Weeding. It's been a crazy week for us because it is back to school time, and it was in particular, back to school time for Will and Emma, who are starting their 6th and 8th grade years at Parnassus Preparatory, a local charter school that they go to. We love the charter school because they're learning Latin and Greek and logic and a lot of the great classical curriculum. And so we're in full swing here, and it means a little homework for them every night and a little homework for me as well as I try to help them. But to celebrate their first day back, we stopped at Starbucks on the way to school, and the nice coffee folks at our local Starbucks wrote happy first day and some encouraging messages on their Starbucks cups, and I thought that was adorable. So I'm happy to report that the first day of school is over and it went well, and we're getting ready for a whole nother year of school and learning. So exciting times for the kids. The other major time commitment that I've had this week is spending time fine-tuning and writing for my website at 6footmama.com. Hopefully, if you check it out, you'll notice some changes there with the format. I've been spending a lot of time this year learning WordPress for my website and then GarageBand for my podcast. And the learning curve has been tough to tackle with the limited bursts of time that I can devote to my self-study of these technical endeavors with the kids and the dog and the house and all of that. But I've really drawn on my background in radio and TV to help refresh me and refresh my broadcasting skills. And I have to say, it's a little like summoning rusty foreign language skills. It does come back. It just is a little bit slow. Back to the world to gardening. Weeds have been a big topic this week. Weeds have been particularly prevalent this year, and the conditions seem to be perfect, I suppose, with all of the rain. And I know weeds aren't the sexiest of gardening topics, but hey, it goes with the territory. So if you go to my blog on this post, you'll see the most resilient weed that I noticed as I was stopped, backed up at a line of cars coming off the freeway. And I glanced over to my right side, and here was this very determined, tenacious weed, actually quite pretty, that had planted itself in the smallest little hole in the sidewalk on the boulevard. And this thing was blooming. It was just cute as can be. And I took a picture of it. So you'll see it there. Maybe if Nancy takes a look at it, she can help us identify it. Interestingly, these days, weeding is becoming more of a science than ever. There's a ton of books out there on weeds. And further, it seems that all the garden bloggers are talking about them. Margaret Roach, who's one of my favorite garden icons, kicks off her second interview this week, an actual encore interview with Terry Dunn Chase, the author of How to Eradicate Invasive Plants, which is another great resource for gardeners, I think. Margaret is even taking what I call a name it and claim it approach. She's challenging herself to learn the names of her weeds so she can better understand them and ultimately regain some control over weeds. As Margaret says, IDing a weed is critical to learning its biology and how it really grows. Garden blogger Tom Leroy uses the same technique that I favor by laying down several layers of newspaper and then covering that with mulch on his latest post called Easy Weeding. On one hand, it's validating to hear that so many gardeners are using this method. It's simple, organic, and effective. On the other hand, I think every gardener is longing to hear of some magical, non-bending required panacea for the battle over weeds. I say we stick with what works, the newspaper mulch trick. As Tom writes on his blog, Is your garden in the middle of a major weed invasion? If your cat wandered in 3 days ago and hasn't been seen since, it may be time to take drastic action before things really get out of hand. Don't give up hope of having a fall garden on account of weeds. Notwithstanding the weed battle, I culled through my own experiences in the garden this summer to outline some lessons in smart gardening. Whether you're a beginner or an experienced digger, I call them the 10 Commandments of Smart Gardening, and they're outlined on my blog this week. I'm sure you'll recognize yourself in some of these guidelines, but I hope they also provide some inspiration for you too, no matter your experience level. As Don Ingebretson, the renegade gardener, told me earlier this summer, any day you start the day out in your garden is a good day. So get in the garden, pull some of those pesky weeds, get the peony relocated, and relax in your favorite spot, dreaming of next year's potential. Well, that's it for The View from Up Here this week. And now I am so pleased to share with you this interview that I had with Nancy Peters, also known as the Weed Lady for Still Growing. She is my featured guest this week. And even though our interview took place nearly a month ago, it was as evident then as it is now that there couldn't be a more appropriate subject than weeds for this summer. So without further ado, here's the interview.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be speaking with you.
And we've had some pretty fun conversations getting ready for this interview.
We have.
Well, why don't you share a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up in New York City and also one of its suburbs briefly, and spent many years in the concrete jungle. So my experience of gardening was really walking in Central Park, looking at wildflowers in the summer. And I didn't know much about gardening. I knew more about finance, about being a mom. I knew about theater going, skiing, sailing, other kinds of activities that I did on the weekend. But when my husband and I bought a house in West Hampton Beach, we didn't know a thing about houses or gardens. We thought our house was fine. And of course, we found out what a fixer-upper it was. We thought all trees were sacrosanct and expected that our fixer-upper would have some kind of garden. The only thing it had was some indestructible hydrangeas, a few specimen trees that were pretty hardy, and the rest of them were weedy volunteers and chlorotic rhododendrons.
Wow. Our
lawn was laughable, and we had a neighbor who was a doll who came by and said, I'll mow your lawn. I do, he doesn't charge very much. He was a school teacher, and he did this in the summer. And then he suggested a lawn service for fertilizing. And I didn't know anything about chemicals, artificial fertilizer, any of that stuff. I knew nothing. So we hired ChemLawn. I can't believe it, True Green ChemLawn. And they did a good job. At least they got rid of some of the stuff. But I didn't do that here when I moved. I learned what the dangers were. But our soil was very sandy. I was in zone 6B. But it was very impoverished. So it was well drained, but poor. And I'm glad we started with soil that was easy to dig because I would have given up.
Yeah.
But our first landscape installation, I thought we had spent a fortune. We spent like $2,000 and it looked like nothing. Like a drop in the bucket. And we got big specimen trees and, all this stuff. And so I began to ogle landscape catalogs on buses and subways on the way to and from work. And finally, in West Hampton Beach, I took a course on organics at the Nature Lyceum. And it changed my point of view. He used to do a thing where he changed the dimes from one hand to the other. I'm going to change your paradigm. So he had 2 dimes. He changed from one hand to the other.
I love professors like that.
I know. He was wonderful. And then I lectured there after I took his course. I told him I was writing this book. And because nobody could explain to me about weeds, so I'd already started writing it, even though I knew nothing. But anyway, he was a big mentor, too. He just passed away. Wonderful guy.
So I saw in your dedication that you have a brother, James, is it Carden?
Carden, right.
Yep, who's an attorney, and he helps proofread your work. Does he share your passion for gardening?
Yes, he does. He actually bought the family's suburban home in Scarsdale when my parents moved to an apartment, and he grows herbs and edibles because he wrote a cookbook.
Oh, he did.
And he grinds his herbs in like a mortar and pestle, and he cooks things from scratch, and they're very inventive, and they do all these clever things. And he also grows flowers and specimen trees. So when I go to visit, I help him prune, help him identify weeds, or I will make new ideas, get suggestions, put your trellis around your tree that just died, or, other things where he can grow his roses. I also bring him plants.
Wow.
And my two other brothers also enjoy gardening.
That was going to be my question. So it kind of all of a sudden started with this generation in your family, huh?
Really. And my mother, who's now 94 and an attendant, she's blind and deaf and everything else, and she's still going. She doesn't want to miss 1 minute of life. She's just still full of vim and vigor. She used to weed as sheep rambled through the yard, and that really inspired us all, I think. She also liked to weed us. She was big on weeding us. Cut your hair, clean your house, all of that. Things that mothers do.
Yep, she was attending to you.
Yes, she was. And my two other brothers have gardens. The doctor has lived in the burbs for years, and he grew vegetables. Not lately because he hasn't been in good health, but I have a scholar and computer whiz living in Cambridge, Mass, and he's got a patio garden. He sent me a picture yesterday. It's gorgeous.
That's wonderful.
So we all like flowers and pretty things.
That's great. So tell us where you live and work now and what zone you're in.
Well, I retired. I live in Spotsylvania, Virginia, which is a delightful Zone 7A.
Oh.
We were looking for a slightly warmer zone, which I'm sure you can appreciate living in Minnesota.
Yeah, I can appreciate a lot.
Yes. My husband hates snow. I love snow. I was an avid skier.
Oh, you were?
And I love winter, and I adore the fall and the spring and everything else. But he hated shoveling it, and I didn't shovel it. All my upper body strength is in my eyelashes. Can you help me with this?
I love that.
Yeah, but he wanted less snow. So I like all four seasons, and I refused to move any further south than Virginia. And we zeroed in on this area on the internet. We knew nobody here, and after watching enough What You Get for the Money on HGTV, to realize that New York and the Hamptons was not a happening place to retire.
Yes.
Yeah, so I wish I'd known how wonderful it is outside the fast-paced New York City area. It really is great.
And you mentioned last night, now you've got this pretty substantial property where you're at.
We have 10 acres. 8.5 of it is wooded. But the trees here are pretty stinky. The Virginia trees, they cut down all the early growth, and so this is second growth trees, and they're very shallow, and they keep falling over in a heavy wind. But it's still gorgeous here. I mean, it's just beautiful countryside, and the weeds that grow here are glorious.
Really?
Yes, they are just magnificent. Well, there are lots of fields, and I'm in farm country, basically, which is wonderful. I have cows behind me. I'm like in a gated community, but behind it are cows. It's pretty heavenly.
Is it hilly there?
No. I lived in Charlottesville, and it was too hilly, and I just, too many drainage problems.
Yeah.
There's a gentle slope down from the house on any side of it. It's like on a little mound. It's perfect. Yeah, that was wonderful. But our first house was in West Hampton Beach, which is one of the Hamptons that's closest to New York City and where we were working.
Yep.
And that's sort of a mild, beach-moderated 6B. But I couldn't grow a lot of plants that I wanted to grow, like crepe myrtle, and I wanted a warmer climate where the southern magnolias and camellias bloomed. And here I am.
Are those your favorites?
No, but I was just frustrated that I couldn't grow them. Mm-hmm. If you ask me on any given day, any plant I look at is my favorite. Roses are my favorite. Clematis are my favorite. Crepe myrtles are my favorite. Cherry blossoms are my favorite. I can go through the whole list. There's so many wonderful flowers in the world. And Auntie Mame has a wonderful expression. She said, the world is a banquet and most poor suckers are starving.
Yeah.
And I think the garden really is a place for abundance and beauty. And I always bring bouquets wherever I go. I take them to the doctor, and the doctors love them. And it makes them at least look at me with some seriousness.
Well,
I hope.
Or at least with appreciation, right?
Yes.
And they want to take care of the lady that brings them flowers.
Yes, and they're scientists, so I can get a conversation going about weeds, and their eyes don't glaze over. Oh. You know, a lot of people, when I talk to them about weeds, their eyes just start to glaze. You know, clever. They're not gardeners. They're like not interested.
Yeah, you clever woman, you.
Oh, thank you.
So in your book, you also thank your mentor, Dr. Andy, is it Senesac?
Senesac, yep. Yes. Andy is young and still peppy and going.
He is.
Yes, and his kids are in college or just getting married or stuff like that. So he's a young'un.
How'd you get to know him?
Huh?
How did you get to know him?
Well, when I took the Master Gardening program in 2004, you have to apply to it, and I explained that I wanted to write a book on weeds, and then I needed to learn a lot about gardening in order to do this. And when I started the course, the woman who ran it said, well, you have to meet our PhD in weed science. So I approached him, and he was totally baffled and looked at me like I had 7 heads. And I told him I wanted to write a book on weeds. And the first question he asked was, do I have a publisher? And I said, if we build it, they will come. And I'm like, boy, was I naive. It took me 10 years to get published. So wow. I had no idea how hard it was to get published when you're unknown, weed aficionado. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not a botanist. I didn't work at a cooperative extension. And, all the rest. My degree is in finance. I mean, hello.
Yeah.
So he put me to work weeding in between the pots of weeds. He had a beautiful weed garden in the Cornell Cooperative Extension in Riverhead, New York. It was in full hot sun, which was killer. But I would read the labels, and I also remade all the labels for him. I took some photos.
Wow.
I asked questions as I weeded. I watched which weeds wimped out and which ones excelled and how they behaved. And I started imposing on him with all my drafts, which he chuckled at, but he read, and he corrected me, and he came up with some ideas, and he encouraged me. And he also identified some of the weeds that stumped me. And I'm his big fan, I have to say.
That's wonderful.
I think he thinks I'm a little kooky because it's like I come out of a world where you make money. And he got into this job where you make like nothing.
Where you make nothing,
being a scholar, and he can't understand why all of a sudden this passion for, a scholarly pursuit that has nothing to do with being lucrative. It's just a fun thing to do.
Well, and he, like me, I have to ask, I'm so curious, why weeds? I mean, what drew you to specialize in something that so many people discard or dislike?
I am so glad you asked. Again, people do look at you like you have 7 heads. Mm-hmm. And what I always say is, well, I grow weeds better than I grow anything else. That's my usual answer, which is true of all of us. I think most people grow weeds better than anything. But more than that, when I started gardening, I couldn't find any kind of source to help me out. I'm a city person. I come from city people or suburban people. No one had big land or anything. So I pulled weeds out, and I would ask at nurseries, which occasionally helped. They got tired of looking at me, and they didn't know the names of all of them. They gave me a printed thing with pictures I couldn't discern, or I showed them to various landscapers and asked them, was this a weed? And they say, oh, I don't know. I have it. Maybe it is. Or when I go on garden tours, nobody knew. You'd ask the guy who was showing you the arboretum and identifying all the trees, and you'd say, well, what's this little thing growing under? He says, I don't know. So nobody seemed to know for sure. And so I decided to look for books. But a lot of the books use botano-speak, which I consider a foreign language. While I studied languages, I started out as theoretically a Russian major, and I loved languages. And I studied lots of other liberal arts things, and I was great with the balance sheet and income statement. I couldn't get the hang of it. Or I found books that were charming and vague, or had drawings and no photos, or didn't have enough photos, and I couldn't match their pictures with what I was seeing. So I figured with all my years doing corporate research projects, I also did internal consulting stuff, and my sales experience, which is, communication, and all my education, surely I could put together the book that I had needed when I started to garden for people who were not gardeners, who were not born farmers. I mean, if we don't weed, we can't successfully enable any of our cultivars to shine. So it was a love basically born of necessity.
I love that quote, too. That's a great quote.
It was. It really was. And I'm very happy that I found this area because my garden is magnificent. I think if I didn't weed it and if I didn't enjoy weeding so much, it wouldn't be nearly so abundant. But the other piece of it is there are all these. When I looked up weeds, there were all these spiritual books. I'm like, oh my God! But
no pun intended.
No pun intended. But everyone's life is filled with problems they need to overcome. And as the daughter of an electronics engineer, I like to posit the problem and find the solution. When I did internal consulting, that was what you do: define the problem, find the solution. So I figured out that compost was the key to rich soil. Remember when you asked me what your friend should do for her sick flocks?
Yes.
And I said, give it compost tea. Well, that's basically my care and feeding of my plants at this point. Is I plant them in compost, and I have an irrigation system, which they also love, and I put compost tea in it, of all the things. The irrigation people thought I was a kook. But I needed help to solve the problem of those pesky weeds. I couldn't figure it out. And because I was used to being weeded by my mother, and I kind of liked some of my own personal, more weedy characteristics, I thought it was a pretty good match.
You identify with them.
I identify with the weeds.
Absolutely.
They are resilient.
Well, and that leads right into my next question, which is, there is a stubborn and resilient quality to weeds, and they're also wild and free. In most other forms, we admire these qualities, yet I'm betting after all your research, you do feel some affection for weeds. Which ones do you have a soft spot for?
Well, they are wild and free. And we, as good citizens and well-behaved members of society, as you are and I am, are a lot less so. It's very hard not to love their bulletproof indestructibility. They're like Spider-Man and Wonder Woman, but of the green world, which is, most little kids want to be Superman or Wonder Woman or one of those creatures. And the weeds are like that. Their primary function is fairly benign. They run into problems when we try to fit them into our ideas of aesthetics or what we'd like to eat or make into bouquets. And that's really the issue. They're kind of like a goofy good Samaritan who runs in to fix a situation, and in most cases they run in to fix broken soil or a problem spot, but they end up fixing the wrong thing or running amok.
Yeah.
Anyway, right?
No good deed goes unpunished, right?
No good deed goes unpunished, and that's the story of weeds. But right now, I love the goldenrods. I pulled them out of my garden beds. That's true. But I replant them at the shadier edges of my woods, and I love their golden fireworks display. And I love your favorite, Queen Anne's lace, which is up everywhere here.
It is.
But it never grew in my richly composting, carefully irrigated garden. I can't grow it. Yeah. I tried transplanting it when I first started gardening, but you need the right kind of spot that it likes to colonize and take over.
Yeah, it does not colonize. I have a very rich garden, to your point.
Oh.
And I'm lucky if I get one in my front bed. And I do love it. And when I see it, I leave it alone because I love it.
Right, that's what I used to do.
Yep.
Yeah, I had one that grew in my last garden, but I have none here. But I'm pea green with envy when I drive around. They're just gorgeous. So
out of curiosity, do you consider yourself to be a little bit of a rebel or a nonconformist?
I think everybody is. I'd say I consider myself more of a pioneer, a bit of a pioneer. I was a woman's libber. I was annoyed that my boyfriends earned more than my girlfriends, who graduated ahead of me. And this drove me to become one of 13 women in a class of 400 men at Columbia Business School. The fact that they were all men didn't hurt either.
Yeah.
I'd been at an all-girls college, but it was fun. But I loved being a mom, and I took time off for that, which is pretty traditional, but it was uncommon in Manhattan. It was almost like pioneering there. Nobody does that in Manhattan. They all hire daughters of the island and head off. There's a workplace, but I was a very typical New York City urbanite, and I had very achievement-oriented ideals. And I was like, rah-rah, America. And as my father used to say, I considered paying taxes a privilege, so that's hardly rebellious. So I was hardly a bomb-throwing radical, though, I certainly knew people who were wild and crazy. But with gardening, the organic areas, I think the new frontier, it's the oldest way that people ever gardened, but it is sort of the new frontier, and weeds are the unexplored mystery land. That's how I look at it. So it satisfies my desire to pioneer.
Yes. Have you heard of Tama Matsuoko Wong, who wrote Foraged Flavor, and she forages and finds weeds and among other things and brings them into restaurants in New York City, and then they cook with them?
Oh, yes, we talked about that. Yeah, I think it's fabulous.
Yeah.
Yeah, the restaurants in New York are always so cutting edge, which is great, and they're always looking for the next imaginative thing. And there's the wild things have delicious flavors. I mean, there are some spectacular things to eat out there.
Have you experimented with that?
I love eating chickweed.
You do?
Common chickweed, Stellaria media, which grows like the dickens in my yard. But I can't eat it as fast as it grows, unfortunately. It's very moist. The little leaves are shaped like spoons as if to invite eating. And they're just yummy. So, and, if you're thirsty, they quench your thirst. If you're hungry, they have something in it that it's called inulin. It's not insulin, but it's inulin, and it actually gets your blood sugar up, so you can stay out in garden longer when you eat it because your blood sugar goes up. You don't get hungry. You don't get thirsty.
Well, there's a little tip. There's a little tip no one has heard, I think.
Oh, yeah. Well, there are a lot of good. There's a lot of good eating. I mean, Virginia pepperweed, they used in studies of glucoraphanin, which is good for lowering your blood pressure. And I mean, glucoraphanins are like a golden password in the nutritionist, whatever it is, that community. I never get a chance to mention glucoraphanins in the course of normal conversation, so I appreciate the opportunity to do so.
Yes. Do you want to say it one more time?
Glucoraphanins. Oh, my other favorite is, I told you, myrmecoccurus, which means seeds that are carried by ants.
Now, are the glucoraphanins?
Really? Yeah,
are they?
Most weeds are. Apparently, some of the weed seeds have something on the end of them called an eleison, like Kyrie eleison, like that song.
Okay,
they have an eleison on the end of their thing that's really delicious to ants. So they take your little tiny weed seeds and carry them over, and they bury them very carefully.
Oh.
Have you ever wondered how another way that weeds spread?
Is that for most weeds then that the ants are doing that?
No, many. They don't all have yummy seeds.
Huh.
they're all different.
Little known fact.
But some of them have the gimmick. You got to have a gimmick if you want to be a weed. There's a song in Gypsy is you got to have a gimmick if you want to get ahead. And each weed has a gimmick. So, and that's how they get ahead. I'll start to sing and then you'll have to change your thing.
I'll save that for the outtakes at the end, right?
Okay.
Well, it's no wonder then that your moniker is the Weed Lady. Can you share the story behind that?
Actually, my publisher started calling me that, and it stuck. I squirmed because I was in college in the late 60s, and the word weed made everyone snigger.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
But they insisted tongue-in-cheek was the way to go.
They did.
So, yeah. So I let it be.
So this has been a term you've had for a very long time then. And it didn't just come with this book.
No. No.
All right, Weed Lady. So your book is called 10 Ways to Tell If It's a Weed. And what was your inspiration for writing it? I know it took about 10 years.
Yes, it did. Actually, the writing of that particular book took me about 3 months, but the whole process took 10 years. My first book was a long and detailed look at the nature of gardening, soil, the names of plants, the in-depth story of 44 weeds, and included photos, drawings, and 200,000 words.
Now, what's the name of that book?
That was called Weeder's Digest.
Oh, my goodness. Weeder's
And
Digest.
I still use it as a reference. I couldn't get it published. And in fact, I had shown it to Cornell, and they compared it with my favorite weed book. So I went away with a rejection and a big happy smile. Because my favorite weed book is Weeds of the Northeast, which Andy Senesac had a role in publishing, by Richard Uva. It's an excellent weed book. It has description on the left side, and on the right side it has several photos of the weeds as babies, as grown-ups, and some comparisons. It's really good, and you can flip through it and find your pictures.
Well, it was high praise that they compared it against that, right?
Well, that's what I thought, even though they said, no, your book's too similar. And they came out with another one that is very similar to Weeds in the Northeast by someone that my brother knew at Harvard. It's amazing, about Weeds of the Urban Northeast, which is an excellent book, too. Yeah,
so it only took you 3 months to write.
I'm sorry?
It only took you 3 months to write it.
It only took me 3 months to write it. So I had written this long first book, which I still use. But in order to get it published, I needed to put together a short, more focused book. That was a suggestion by Cornell, and I couldn't think of a good focus. And I just, went away and with my wounds. And since every new book on the web was called 10 Ways to, Search Engine Optimize, or 10 Ways to blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I decided to narrow it down to 10 ways to do something. And one of the lectures I had given at the Nature Lyceum was basically focused on how can you tell if something's a weed? Because I didn't use slides. He didn't want to use slides. He wanted to be totally technologically backwards, which was fine. And so you have to talk about, more generalities. So it was very easy to take that outline, and the book basically just wrote itself. Since I'd given the lecture over a dozen times.
You're kidding.
No, I love teaching at the Nature Lyceum. You'd have about 12 people, and they were all kind of fruity and weird, and they loved, knowing that without water sinks and trees communicate with each other. They really went off onto some of these wild and woolly tangents, but they were all basically dedicated to the organics, which I became very dedicated to too.
And now I know, what drew me to your book is the beautiful cover of it. I love the yellow, and
thank you.
I loved your picture. I love the whole thing. But your book is available online only.
Right.
But yet you still have to make a cover for it, right?
That's right. And they designed, again, that was something that my publisher came up with. I had a lovely picture of weeds, and they took a photograph of me and made that cover.
They did.
And I said, I'm embarrassed. They said, no, it's a good cover. It has visual circularity. And I said, I got to write that one down.
Visual circularity.
Yeah, I like that. I thought that was pretty groovy. And I love yellow.
I love yellow, too.
My favorite yellow sweatshirt in that picture. So,
well, gardeners like yellow. I think that's an appealing thing. Now, I noticed there's a dandelion on the front, Queen Anne's lace, and I don't know the other two.
Pokeweed.
Okay.
And the Centaurea maculosa.
Is that the one at the top?
Spotted knapweed.
Is that the one at the top?
I think so.
The big purple?
The one that has the pretty purpley pink flower. Yeah, that's spotted knapweed. It's in the ester family, like the dandelions.
Oh.
So each one of those petals is actually a flower with reproductive parts at the base and pollen for any little critter that wants to go eat the pollen.
It's actually quite pretty.
Drink the nectar. Yeah, they are beautiful.
Wow. Yeah. Now, it is very empowering to look at a plant and be able to identify it and take action to know if it's a weed or if it's a plant you want to keep. In your experience, how has developing that skill helped you grow as a gardener?
Absolutely enormously. I really do appreciate the question because I really was baffled when I started. And it's helped me to grow a lavish, super abundant garden. It also helped me justify all the excesses in my garden beds. I'd say, if you have weeds, you just don't have enough plants to cover the bare bosom of the soil. I love saying that. And and it's helped me to take, I learned it from, I went to there was a fish store in the Hamptons, And he had the most gorgeous gardens. You know, and I asked if he had enriched it with fishes and stuff like that. He said, I've been putting in compost for years. And there was not one weed in the garden. It was just so densely packed. It was just happiness itself. You know, poppies, tons of them. He said, whatever makes it to the sun survives, whatever doesn't, it's too bad. So I kind of liked his philosophy, but it's helped me to take control of what I'd like to see in a garden and to express my own creative preferences and tastes. I tried being a landscaper, but found I didn't enjoy catering to anyone else after years of being a corporate lackey.
Yeah.
You know, when you're working and you're getting paid, you do what the customer wants.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what do you want? How would you like it? What are your needs? What kind of thing do you want? And there are people who wanted like spaces in between their plants, which I find anathema. So I just couldn't do it. It was crushing to me to have to do a garden that looked neat. So I love the creativity, and I also learned from all my studying that my cultivars could misbehave, and I began to cull plants out, which seemed to me horrendous to actually remove a plant. And even now, if my mother sees me pruning, she'll say, "What are you doing? How can you?" And I tell her, "No, if you cut the roses, they do better. They like it." She's like, "No, you're cutting the flowers."
Yeah.
Don't do that. You know, when you have to thin out seedlings, no, don't take those away. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I just interviewed Shane Smith from the Cheyenne, Wyoming Botanic Garden, and he said,
how wonderful!
Yeah, he said the same thing. He said that the best time to go out and prune or to thin is when you're angry about something, because you're going to do maybe a little bit more aggressively than you would otherwise, and you'll end up with a better result. So I thought that was great
how well
advice.
they grow.
Yeah,
I tried it with some new things this year. I cut back my tall growing phlox. And I said, well, they'll grow denser foliage and more flowers. Really, I wanted to see some of the other plants that they were blocking.
Yep.
Well, don't you know? They grew back shorter, thicker, bushier with more flowers.
Oh, how great.
It's like, yeah. And then I was denuding one of my roses that had really grown wild. It's in the rugosa family. And I had it. It's like, looks like bare sticks. I said, just wait. It has just resumed its normal hugeness.
Yeah.
And it's covered with roses that, of course, the Japanese beetles are eating now, which is another story.
Yeah, that is another story.
That's acceptance. That was my lesson in acceptance.
Yeah, listen. Man, we get a lot of lessons in acceptance as gardeners, don't we?
Oh, yes, you do. You learn patience, which I certainly, as a New Yorker, that was not one of my big things.
I don't think Scandinavians are very patient either when it comes to gardening.
I don't think so either. I don't think so either.
Well, speaking of pruning, I had a Canadian shrub rose that I was just tired of, and it was not doing what I wanted it to do. And so I chopped it completely to the ground. And it was probably about 4 or 5 feet tall. And I had every intention of, once I had demolished this thing, of going in and digging it out. But, of course, 4 kids and the dog and yada, yada, yada. Well, I'm back in my garden this week, and I'll be darned if that thing is not as big as it was when I pruned it in May and covered in flowers.
Happy. They're happy.
Yeah.
My brother said when I showed him how to prune his roses, he said, I can hear my roses sighing. Ah, that felt so good. I think that's true.
It's probably like getting a mani-pedi.
I think so. I think the flowers respond to attention, just like any living thing responds to attention.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, yeah.
Now, your book essentially walks readers through 10 important questions to ask regarding whether a plant is a weed or not. And you start out by asking if known cultivars or crops have disappeared as the plant in question grows. And I thought that this is a great question that gardeners should ask. Can you tell us a little bit more about this one?
This was really how I learned about weeds. In my very naive early days, I planted young seedlings, and I had great hopes. I had these dreams of this garden that was going to emerge, and they were completely overwhelmed by established plants, which was okay, but even more often by plants I couldn't identify. And my seedlings were hard to identify, too. They didn't look anything like the catalog. The catalog shows them in full bloom.
Yes.
But those pesky weeds just grew so fast, and they were so satisfying until I found patches of lawn overrun and plants entangled in killer vines. And then I readjusted my focus on the invaders and figured I need some strategy to compensate for my lower level of upper body strength. I've done a lot of things to try to compensate for my lower level of upper body strength.
I'm with you, Nancy. I'm with you.
Yeah, we have to. Us girls have to use some extra strategy.
I always say in my next life, I'm coming back as a man, and I'm going to do drywalling, and I'm going to move boulders, and there's a lot of things I want to do.
I know, and I can't do them now.
No.
You just can't. Like carrying my skis was hard. I tried snowboarding to catch up with my daughter, and I couldn't push myself off when I fell. When you fall on the ground, you have to do push-ups to get yourself back up. And it's like there's this middle-aged lady trying to push herself out. It was pretty pathetic.
Hey, I can't carry my groceries anymore, so I guess that's why I've got the 4 kids.
Please.
So, yeah. Now, when you see something disappearing, is that when you take action, or do you already know that a weed is going to start taking over just by all of your work?
No, I don't know. I'm just as surprised as anybody.
You are.
I find them enchanting and surprising.
Yeah, they are surprising.
And their varieties never cease to delight and amaze me. And frustrate me. Because just as I think I understand something, I find something else I don't know anything about. So I could spend the next 100 years learning about plants and never get to the end of it.
And they're a little unpredictable too, because some they can go for years being well behaved. You're monitoring them; they're minding their own business, right. And then all of a sudden, the next year, they just take over. Well,
I have a friend now. You had the question about notoriously speedy growers.
Yes,
and my friend Therese has beautiful forsythia that she's had for 30 years that she's owned her house. All of a sudden, they took over like a whole section of her yard. And in the last few days, she has dug up first 6 plants, and then the next day she dug up 5. And today she said she dug up 17. And she got that, the buzz you get when you're working in the garden until you're past exhaustion.
Yes.
She was like totally buzzed out on having removed the forsythia, but they're not a weed. They're a cultivar, but they get crazy. But it took them 30 years. They behaved themselves. They were, good citizens for a long time. And then all of a sudden, somebody said, it's time for you guys to cut loose and do your thing.
And they knew that, or did she cut the mother plant out then? And then that's what triggered it, or what?
It could have been the mother plant had been growing babies all along.
Okay. And
they finally got old enough to bloom. That you don't see them underground. I mean, my favorite underground sneaky rapid grower that I just discovered, I've written about it, but I had never seen it before, was common blue violet.
Okay.
And I had actually gotten them from Therese. She had given me some, I can't seem to grow lily of the valley.
Me neither.
Convallaria.
Yep.
And so she had given me some. She said, I just take these clumps and I throw them out in the woods and then they take. She doesn't even plant them. She just throws the whole clump out. Well, I put a bunch of them in, and the only thing that grew were these violets, which I had written about, the common blue violet, Viola papilionacei, specifically. And it has what they call cleistogamous flowers, which is another wonderful vocabulary. This is what I'm saying. It's all botano speak.
Yes.
But I thought cleistogamous flowers. What? Anyway, I figured I'd never see them. Well,
it sounds awful, doesn't it?
It does. It sounds dirty. Yeah. So I was digging them up, and they were dirty. They were under the dirt. So I picked them up, and I said, "Oh, Joe, you have to come see this. I found a real cleistogamous rib. It's got flowers on it. Let's get the camera." So I started taking pictures, and he always takes better photographs. But I actually got to see what the flowers look like. And you can literally see them in bud. And if you take the camera, they're fascinating. And they spread like the dickens. It takes them a while to establish because they're perennials. It's like the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. Yep. But sometimes it's the first decade they sleep. Whatever it is. Well, a couple of my least favorite fast growers are hairy bittercress, called cardamom hirsuta. And I told everyone when they were asking me about weeds, I said, you probably have cardamom hirsuta, hairy bittercress. And it wrote in on the pots of my nursery grown plants. That's where it started. That's where the infestation. It's not in weed books that are old. It's in new weed books.
And it's called hairy bittercress.
Bittercress.
Okay.
And it's in the mustard family.
Oh.
And as a mustard family member, its seeds explode and help propel it everywhere. I got a photograph in my book where you can actually almost see the movement as the seeds explode.
Really?
Which to me was amazing. I found another great picture of weeds screwing themselves into the soil of seeds, but that was on a Micron or Electric, whatever, some special website. But that's, any mustard family has prodigious numbers of seeds, but they also explode. I mean, I didn't know they exploded. They pop.
Yeah.
They can ping right into your eyes if you're not careful. Common chickweed also does that. And in cool seasons, it regenerates when it's broken. It stretches like elastic. And it grows even when you take it out of the soil. It continues to grow even when it's pulled out.
You're kidding.
Nope. I put it in a pot. And I threw it, when I was weeding, I throw things in these. I used to use kitty litter buckets. And I throw them in until they stop making those. And I left it for a few days. And it had got a little rainwater. It was disgusting. All of a sudden, I see this plant flowering.
Oh, honestly.
And I said, what is it? So there you go.
And there it is. Well, when I was a little girl, I had a little charm bracelet. And I think it was my mom's when she was little. And it had a little charm. And inside the charm, it was like a little glass bead. And it had a mustard seed. And I think, yes. And I think it was I'm sure it was for something like if you have faith the size of a mustard seed.
Size of a mustard seed.
Yeah. And yes. And when I was looking at it as a little kid, I couldn't believe it because that thing, and I still have it, it's very, very minuscule.
They're minuscule. Mm-hmm. And their tininess is their advantage because they can fly in the wind.
Yep. They
can be digested. They can go through someone's digestion, come out with compost on the other end and get planted. Tiny size is a mighty powerful force.
Yes, it is.
The same thing with a common chickweed. I compare it in my other book to my second book, the mass of peasants in revolt that overtake the ground. You get little tiny peasants running all over, and they overrun the whole manor house and take over, all the armed guards and everything else.
Yeah. They can.
But they're powerful.
Yeah, they are powerful. You share in your book that the English common name dandelion comes from a French term meaning tooth of the lion to reflect its roaring proliferation as much as to reflect its jagged leaf lobes, taproots, and petals. Let's spend a few minutes on dandelions, which are probably the weed that is most recognized by gardeners and non-gardeners alike. What can you tell us about dandelions?
Well, my favorite thing that I just learned. Well, I'll tell you how I started writing about dandelions. I was speaking to a woman who was French. And she said, dandelions. In French, we call them pissenlit. I said, pissenlit? She said, yeah, it makes you wet the bed. So that got me started. I thought that was hilarious. So, of course, I had to try it. And I was, totally out of control after that. It was it really is a diuretic.
It is.
Oh, totally. So I started reading up on it, and not only is it highly nutritious, it was one of the choice weeds for people to eat as a winter tonic, when people were sick over the winter and they'd see the dandelions green up. You can use the roots as coffee like you can for chicory. You can make beer and wine out of it. You can eat all the parts of it. It's apparently good for arthritis. Its Latin name taraxacum comes from one of the components, taraxacin, which is apparently very good for arthritis. Go figure.
Well,
now, also a phrase I don't get to use very much in conversation.
No. And if it's that strong of a diuretic, you can kind of see where it's probably good to kind of help you detox if you are sick.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And the thing that I have just discovered that just astonished me is I was looking at a seed once. I was daydreaming, and I had a seed in my hand, and I couldn't see it. So for Valentine's Day, my husband bought me a microscopic camera, which I can't figure out how to use. So it sits there as a token of his love. And I went online and decided to look up seeds.
Poor Joe.
And the lazy girls were, well, he does the same thing.
Oh.
So he has toys he wanted and he never ends up playing with. But
is one of them an iron?
Huh?
Is one of them an iron?
No, I have no irons in this house.
Okay.
I gave that up when I moved. But the pappus on the dandelion seed itself, you can see that puffball seed head. If you look at it closely, it looks like a dimpled golf ball. And if you look at the seeds under the microscope, they have ridges all over them to hold them into the little receptacle. And then on top, and also to help them when they land, and it's a hard seed case. But on top of them, they have what's called a pappus, which is the little parachutes. Well, you think those little parachutes, they're eensy-weensy and there's not much to them. There's a whole structure in there. They're filled with tubes that hold water, and they have little hooks on the end to help them adhere. And they've done studies that show that dandelion seeds with the pappus attached, with their little parachute attached, germinate 30% better than the other seeds, or some kind of number. I can't remember what the numbers are. Germinates much better and grows faster. And that's because the pappus retains water, like a woman who eats salt.
Yep.
So it's just like that.
So it comes with its own ready-made irrigation.
Right.
When it's trying to get started.
And it's the same of many other plants in the aster family that have puffball seed heads. But that was the thing that I found absolutely fascinating. But there are a zillion recipes for dandelions, and they sell them in supermarkets. And it was a savior for many people during the potato famine. People would go and eat their dandelions, and it was considered really choice edibles.
Now, eradicating weeds or invasives is a real challenge for people, obviously. And sometimes I joke that the word eradicating isn't strong enough for some weeds.
That's true.
Yeah, it's true. And sometimes taking effective steps with invasive plants can be really overwhelming for gardeners, even experienced gardeners. What are some of the hardest weeds to eradicate? And what are your tips for eradicating invasives in general?
Okay, one of the best sources for that is books on global invasives. There's a Brooklyn Botanic Garden book that will define whether something is a global invasive. The ones I've come to know are Japanese knotweed, spotted knapweed, and Canadian thistle. And basically, my tips are treat, repeat, cover the soil, grow a competitor, then treat and repeat. And then cover the soil again, grow a competitor, and treat and repeat.
Okay.
There is, when you think about it, all of these things have roots that will grow. They have phenomenal. The numbers are preposterous. Like the root will grow 6 inches thick and grow 15 feet under the ground. So you think you're pulling it out, and if you cut it open and you carefully paintbrush on some herbicide so that the maximum amount of herbicide is translocated down to the root. I mean, how are a few drops of herbicide going to kill a plant that is the size of the universe? I mean, the roots are just immense on these things. Plus, all of these plants have the added advantage of what's called allelopaths, which I go into a lot in my next book, which is chemicals that they emit that poison the soil for other plants. So, you know how people will dogs will piss mark their territory?
Yes.
Plants do too. And some of the worst invasives are serious, thuggish territory markers. They're more like gang members who say you cannot sell drugs in my area. We're the only ones who can sell drugs here. So they actually change the nature of the soil. They'll encourage the growth of anaerobic bacteria that most plants can't grow with. And they have a whole arsenal of tricks to, murder everyone else. And you had asked me again about the Canadian thistle.
Yes.
And I had done in my book, I wrote a thing about it as an armory. I did Warfare Waged by Canadian Thistle.
Yes.
And first, I put this in the book, but it was a foreign invader and stowed away in hay to feed the horses of British General Burgoyne during the War of Independence. And he lost the war, but the American colonists survived, and so did this weed. And it's on a whole bunch of wanted dead, not alive lists. Those are very funny. They have those posters for weeds.
Yes.
Like the weeds can read. Hello?
Yes.
So it's been mandated for removal for years. It has its uses and all the rest of it. But the warfare wages, it has barricades. It has sharp prickles on its leaves, which are mechanical things. Underground, it has vertical roots to as much as 23 feet that support up to 18 feet of extensive lateral roots that generate new plant cones every 2 to 6 inches. You want to try to fight that one. Their timing strategies, they have staggered growth stages occur at the same time. And they have battalions of seed dispersal forces. Each seed has the same as what the dandelion has, the achene with the hard armor on the seed case, and the pappus, which is a fluffy parachute. So it's the airborne division. And they have endless reinforcements by hardy perennial seeds and vigorous seedlings. And they have surprise attack because it's an alien invader. It came here without any biocontrols to keep it in check. So they call them naive natives. And they have no tools to fight it back. It has biological warfare. It hosts diseases, and it has chemical warfare. It has those chemicals that inhibit other crops. This one chemical it has, knisin, will reduce yields in corn 80%, 95% in soybeans, 60% in wheat. So it's the killer. And it'll attack your food supplies. It has high nitrate levels that can distress or kill grazers.
How tall?
And it also enlists human assistance. Sorry.
Go ahead. It enlists human assistance.
Assistance because it has pretty, fragrant flowers, and that gain protection from uncertain gardeners. And people assisted spread, even as more bird watchers, butterfly gardeners, and beekeepers keep more of these turncoats around. So I wrote, while it overwinters better than Napoleon's army did in Russia, it can't make it in the South.
It can't.
No, not in the really hot South. It can, further south of me.
Well, it does just fine in Minnesota, I can tell you that.
I know. Well, it's wonderful in the middle of the country. It's a real problem. And, with the rangers, they tell people to wash off the tires of their vehicles. Like, yeah, right, I'm going to come out of the woodlands, or I'm going to come out of the field or the prairie and wash down my tires so I don't spread weeds.
Yeah. It would be a great job for kids, but sadly we probably wouldn't have the water supply.
No. Well, that's the other thing. Right, exactly.
Yeah. Huh. How tall can they get? Because I'm ashamed to say
I'd have to look that up.
Yeah, I'm ashamed to say I think I've pulled some that are 4 or 5 feet high by the time I find them, because they are sneaky. They like to kind of nestle right in with Queen of the Prairie or Joe Pyeweed, other tall specimens. And
oh, that's horrifying. I found that with weeds, the estimates that I get out of books are inaccurate. I told Andy Sensak, my guru, that I had chickweed that came up to my hip. And he said, doesn't grow that high. I said, mine does. Yeah. I measured it from the bottom of my foot to the top of my head.
You're the weed lady.
I'm the weed. It grows high. It grows high as an elephant's eye. It looks like it's climbing right up. And when there's shade, I have some crabgrass that must be 6 foot tall. I have this whole sea. There's a magnificent sea of salvia, black and blue, which is naturalized here. I couldn't grow it except as an annual in New York, but here it has taken. And it forms like a big weedy clump of itself. But I have crabgrass that's grown even taller than that. And you see the little crab fingers creeping out from under. It's not supposed to grow that tall. I'm like, don't you read the books?
Yeah.
Don't you know you're not supposed to do that?
And yet they're doing it.
And yet they're doing it.
Well, that was super fun, and that concludes my first part of my interview with Nancy Peters, the Weed Lady. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd also like to invite you to stay tuned for part 2, which will be in the very next episode of Still Growing. Again, I want to thank Nancy for being on the show. You can find this podcast on iTunes as well as Stitcher Radio or the BlackBerry Podcast, and you can also subscribe directly to the blog post to get them via email. I'll have all the information from the show today at 6footmama.com. That's the number 6FTMAMA.com, and you can find this episode in the top menu under the Still Growing Podcast. You can always find me at 6footmama.com or on facebook.com/stillgrowing with 6footmama. You can also email me directly at jennifer@6footmama.com. Feel free to send in your questions for the Master Gardener Roundtable, which airs every other month on Still Growing. Your question will be answered either via email or during the podcast. Still Growing with Jennifer Ebling is a 6footmama.com production made in lovely Maple Grove, Minnesota. Still Growing is an hour-long weekly gardening podcast dedicated to helping you and your garden grow. Okay, so in honor of my interview with Nancy Peters, the Weed Lady, the boys, PJ and John, are going to read a scholastic book that my mom, Grandma, found for them, and it's called Dandelions, Stars in the Grass, and it's by Mia Posada. Okay, PJ?
I know that some people call it a weed, but to me, the dandelion is a noble breed. Bright yellow petals adorn each one, spreading out like rays of the sun.
And spring dandelions bloom like gold stars in the grass, growing taller and taller as the warm days passed.
Under sunny summer skies, the flowers are visited by bees and butterflies.
The flower begins to change on one summer day. Their bright yellow petals fold up and fall away, and plates of petals emerge, fluffy tufts of white.
They form a perfect circle, delicate and light.
The wind blows them loose, sweeping them into the sky.
Like tiny umbrellas, they float up high.
Every flying tuft the wind has freed carries with it a tiny seed.
The tufts float on the wind until falling to rest. A nice grassy hillside is what they like best. Into the soil a seed snuggles down. Slender new roots tunnel deep underground.
Fragile green leaves begin to grow, sprouting up from the earth to below. Look closely and you'll find rounds of buds of green, but bright yellow petals are yet to be seen.
The buds slowly open, facing the sky. Sunlight and water will help them grow high.
As summer moves on, sunny and warm, seeds become flowers, new dandelions form.
The end.